In the summer of 1944, amid the sweltering heat of a prisoner of war camp on American soil, a group of German soldiers had just finished building a small stone bridge across a stream inside the base. Wiping sweat from their brows, they froze in disbelief as a U.S. officer approached and handed each of them a payslip, compensation for the work they had done over the past week. Prisoners of war being paid to build infrastructure for the enemy? It sounded deeply paradoxical and almost impossible. Yet it was entirely real during World War II. The image of German soldiers in POW uniforms painstakingly mixing mortar, stacking stones to build bridges in the United States, then standing stunned as they received their modest wages, has since become one of the most astonishing and little-known stories of the war. By early 1943, the course of World War II began to shift decisively against the Axis powers. In North Africa, after months in which General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had repeatedly thrown the Allies off balance, the tide finally turned. The Battle of El Alamein, in late 1942, opened the way for an Anglo-American counteroffensive, followed by the Tunisian campaign, which closed the final pincer. In May 1943, the North African front collapsed completely. More than 150,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to the Allies, creating an enormous mass of prisoners that Britain was no longer able to hold under the conditions of total war. London was already stretched thin, facing shortages of detention facilities, food supplies, and guarding personnel, while also enduring the constant threat of bombing and sabotage on the home islands. As a result, Britain asked the United States to share the burden by accepting and holding a portion of these prisoners on American soil. Although the American prison camp system had not yet expanded to meet such demands, and federal authorities understood that this would pose a major logistical challenge, Washington agreed. The United States had space, rail networks, large inland training bases, and most importantly, the ability to guarantee security far more effectively than the temporary and vulnerable facilities in Europe. From mid-1943 onward, ships carrying German and Italian prisoners crossed the Atlantic and arrived at ports such as Norfolk in Virginia and New York. The prisoners were then transferred to U.S. military control and loaded onto specially organized railway transports, which carried them deep into the interior, according to a strict rule that camps must be located at least 170 miles from the coast. This measure was designed to minimize any chance of contact with submarines, spies, or escape networks, while also keeping prisoners away from densely populated coastal areas that could easily become centers of public anxiety and controversy. German soldiers emerging from what many called the Desert Hell and the grinding battles of North Africa often carried both physical exhaustion and deeply ingrained prejudice. Many had spent months suffering from shortages of water and medicine, only to suddenly fall into enemy hands, their state of mind swinging between fear and an expectation of the worst. Years of relentless propaganda had convinced not a few of them that if captured by the Allies, they would be tortured, humiliated, or even executed. Yet from the very first days on American soil, many prisoners encountered a complete break from the picture they had imagined. One German prisoner recorded in his memoir that when his group arrived in the United States, they were not crammed into livestock cars or packed freight wagons as they had been in Europe. Instead, they were placed in passenger rail cars, with padded seats that were clean and orderly. He wrote, "Up to that point, we had only ever been transported in crowded freight cars, so these rail cars with soft upholstered seats came as a genuine and pleasant surprise to everyone. Then an African-American attendant came in, carrying coffee and sandwiches, and served us politely as if we were human beings too, causing most of us to forget much of the resentment toward Americans that had built up during our time as prisoners in North Africa. What was truly shocking was not simply the food or the seats, but the realization that they were still being treated as individuals with names and dignity, rather than as faceless objects on which anger could be vented. In those very first hours, many German prisoners understood that they were entering a fundamentally different experience, a detention system governed by discipline, rules, and logistical calculation, rather than by emotional revenge. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States rapidly expanded its detention network, establishing more than 500 prisoner of war camps across the country and holding a total of roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German. The system was typically organized into main camps and subsidiary camps. The main camps were usually located at existing military bases or large training centers, such as Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and Camp Swift in Texas. These sites were equipped with fences, guard towers, infirmaries, kitchens, warehouses, living quarters, and centralized facilities for record-keeping and guard units. Each main camp generally held between 3,000 and 6,000 prisoners and functioned as a coordinating hub. The subsidiary camps were smaller detention sites, sometimes housing only a few dozen to a few hundred prisoners, placed near farms, sawmills, construction sites, or towns. Their purpose was to shorten travel distances for labor details, improve administrative efficiency, and reduce security risks associated with transporting prisoners over long distances. This distribution served two distinct purposes. On the one hand, it was about security, keeping prisoners deep in the interior, dispersing them, and maintaining tight control. On the other hand, it was about economics and logistics, moving prisoners to precisely those areas where the United States faced the most severe labor shortages. With most young American men deployed overseas, many farms lacked workers for harvesting. Factories were short of unskilled labor, and infrastructure projects were disrupted. The U.S. government saw in these hundreds of thousands of prisoners a potential labor force that could be mobilized within an international legal framework, provided that the Geneva Convention rules on prisoner labor were observed. The work could not directly support combat operations. Working conditions had to be safe and supervised, and wages had to be paid as required. This became the critical foundation that led directly to a situation that sounded almost unreal, but was entirely real. German prisoners of war, building bridges for the United States, and being paid to do so. From the very beginning of accepting prisoners, the U.S. government stated clearly that it would strictly adhere to the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. This was not a symbolic pledge. The convention, to which both Germany and the United States were signatories, laid out specific requirements. Prisoners had to be guaranteed living conditions comparable to those of the detaining power's own soldiers, in terms of food, housing, medical care, and sanitation. They were not to be subjected to arbitrary punishment or humiliation. And if they were employed as laborers, that work could not directly serve military purposes, could not be excessively dangerous, and had to be compensated according to established rules. For Washington, compliance with the Geneva Convention was not only a way to avoid international legal complications, but also a matter of strategy and moral positioning. The United States wanted to demonstrate to the world that it was fundamentally different from the Nazi regime, while also holding on to the hope, however fragile, that such proper treatment might influence how American soldiers would be treated if they were captured. The realities of war often proved that hope to be unmet, but that failure did not cause the United States to abandon its chosen approach. Because the Geneva Convention was followed so strictly, life inside American prisoner of war camps became almost unbelievably bearable for most German soldiers. The larger camps were not merely detention sites, but functioned much like enclosed towns. Inside were wooden or brick living quarters, infirmaries staffed by U.S. Army doctors, chapels for religious services, libraries stocked with German and English books, and newspapers, movie theaters showing both American films and German films from the pre-war period, soccer fields, volleyball courts, and in some cases even theaters and amateur orchestras organized by the prisoners themselves. The food alone stunned many newcomers. Prisoner rations were nearly equivalent to those of American soldiers, with 3 meals a day that included meat, vegetables, bread, milk, and coffee. In letters home, many prisoners admitted something that sounded deeply paradoxical. They were eating better than they ever had while serving in the German army. Part of this was due to the abundance of food in the United States, and part to the fact that many camps employed German cooks who had worked in civilian kitchens before the war and knew how to prepare meals to suit familiar tastes. In terms of appearance, a certain level of military order was still maintained. On holidays, or during formal events, prisoners were allowed to wear their old uniforms, while in daily life and during work details, they wore issued clothing marked with large PW letters on the back and pant legs for easy identification. Beyond food and housing, prisoners were encouraged to stay physically active and mentally engaged. They played sports, forming soccer and volleyball teams that competed within and between camp compounds. Camps produced wall newspapers, magazines, and even internal radio broadcasts run by the prisoners themselves under relatively light American supervision, providing updates on the war and camp life. Those interested in education could attend classes in foreign languages, mathematics, history, and technical subjects taught by highly educated fellow prisoners, and some even enrolled in American Correspondence University courses. The International Red Cross regularly sent books, musical instruments, and craft supplies into the camps, helping prisoners pass the time and maintain morale. Of course, this was not a free society. Military discipline remained clearly in place. Prisoners elected German camp representatives to maintain internal order. But all decisions were subject to oversight by American officers. Fanatical Nazis who threatened or terrorized fellow prisoners or undermined discipline were separated and transferred to special disciplinary camps, including several facilities in Oklahoma that were used to isolate these extremist groups. In practice, however, the majority of German prisoners were not radical Nazi believers. After years of war, they were exhausted, had lost faith in victory, and accepted the relative safety of camp life until the war came to an end. It was precisely this contrast that made many prisoners struggle to believe in their own good fortune. A U.S. Army report noted that most prisoners were astonished by the abundance of food and the comfortable living conditions, and admitted that throughout their entire military careers, they had never been treated so well. The irony was unmistakable. Men who had been portrayed through propaganda as Nazi monsters were now being fed, medically cared for, and housed by their enemy at a level that some American frontline soldiers could only envy. This inevitably provoked backlash among the American public. Newspapers at the time mocked the prisoner camps by calling them the Fritz Ritz, a sarcastic reference to a luxury hotel supposedly reserved for German soldiers. Many civilians complained that while their own families lived under rationing, saving every scrap of butter, prisoners were eating well. Tensions flared in several incidents. At one camp, prisoners were able to buy cigarettes for 5 cents a pack, far cheaper than the rationed price paid by American civilians. This led to scenes in which some prisoners rode through nearby towns on trucks, thumping their chests and boasting about cheap cigarettes, provoking anger among local residents. Under public pressure, the U.S. military made adjustments in the final stages of the war, such as cutting back on certain luxury rations and restricting the sale of subsidized cigarettes, especially as supplies grew tighter. Even so, the core framework of treatment established under the Geneva Convention remained intact. And it was within this context that another policy was introduced. One that was legal, practical, and astonishing, both to those who experienced it and to later generations, allowing German prisoners of war to work and paying them for their labor. Under the Geneva Convention, non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, meaning ordinary soldiers, could be required to work while in captivity, provided that the work was safe, non-punitive in nature, and did not directly support the war effort of the detaining power. Enemy officers were exempt from forced labor, and the United States observed this rule quite strictly. German officers were generally confined to camp life or assigned internal administrative and supervisory duties, and were never sent out to fields or construction sites. International law also clearly stipulated that if prisoners of war were employed as laborers, they had to be paid appropriately rather than subjected to forced labor. The United States did not merely accept these rules on paper, but actively turned them into operating policy. As a result, tens of thousands of German prisoners became a distinct labor force on American soil, helping sustain farms, workshops, and even build infrastructure for the very nation that had once been their enemy. This raises an obvious question. Why was the United States willing to do this? The answer lies in the cold realities of total war. At the time, America faced an acute labor shortage. Millions of able-bodied men had entered military service or were working in defense industries. Farms lacked workers for harvesting. Sawmills lacked hands, and civilian construction and infrastructure projects were disrupted or stalled. Meanwhile, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners held inside the United States were essentially sitting idle. From Washington's perspective, allowing such a vast pool of manpower to be fed and housed without being put to use was an unacceptable waste. The government therefore chose to mobilize this labor force, but strictly within the boundaries of international law. At first, the allocation of prisoner labor was handled in a relatively ad hoc manner through direct agreements with local farms and production facilities. As the program expanded, the U.S. Army worked more closely with labor coordination agencies to assign prisoners to the areas suffering the most severe manpower shortages. All prisoners who were physically able were placed into labor details, with the exception of officers. The work was tightly regulated. Prisoners were not allowed to manufacture weapons, transport military supplies, train troops, or have direct contact with combat operations. Instead, they were assigned to purely civilian tasks, such as agriculture, forestry, and civilian construction, as well as routine duties inside military camps, ranging from kitchen work and laundry to facility maintenance and repairs. Working hours followed civilian norms, with 6 days of labor per week and Sundays off. What truly astonished many German prisoners was the issue of wages. Every prisoner who took part in labor was paid, even though the amount was low by American standards. In the early period, the standard rate was 80 cents per day, roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private performing unskilled labor. Later, in some locations, this figure was adjusted slightly, but overall, 80 cents remained the norm. In a wartime economy, this was a small sum. For a prisoner of war, however, its significance went far beyond material value. Wages were usually not issued in cash, but in the form of vouchers or credit accounts that could be used at camp canteens to purchase supplementary food, cigarettes, soap, and personal items. In some camps, prisoners were allowed to receive cash and were escorted by guards into nearby towns to shop. Wherever the money was spent, the simple fact of being paid for one's own labor felt almost unimaginable. Each prisoner, whether assigned to work or not, also received a small daily allowance to buy basic necessities. Those who worked had this allowance increased to reach the full wage level. Employers, whether farmers, factory owners, or local authorities, paid labor fees to the U.S. government at rates higher than what the prisoners themselves received, with the difference used to cover the costs of camp administration. If wages were not fully spent, the remaining balance was recorded in individual accounts and paid out when the war ended, before repatriation. As a result, many German prisoners returned home with several $100s in hand, a substantial sum amid the devastation of post-war Germany. Try placing yourself in their position. These were men who had once fought in battle, who had believed that if they fell into enemy hands, they would die or be brutalized. Now they were working for wages in the United States, collecting pay at the end of the day, then buying beer and cigarettes at the camp canteen in the evening. This stark contrast made many prisoners doubtful at first, even suspicious. But the pay vouchers were real. The goods they could buy were real. and living conditions improved day by day. Many quickly realized that labor did not only bring money, but also freed them from the suffocating monotony of camp life. One former prisoner later recalled that none of the jobs they were assigned were excessively hard, and that most of them were actually glad to go to work, simply because it made time pass more quickly. Labor helped them maintain a daily rhythm, preserve their morale, and feel that they still had value. Quite a few prisoners worked so diligently that they earned the respect and approval of their American employers, and in some cases, even formed friendly relationships. In certain areas, American farmers treated the German prisoners who worked for them like members of the family, and many years after the war, they remained in contact, meeting again in deeply emotional reunions. When looking at the specific jobs German prisoners performed on American soil, this picture becomes even clearer and more paradoxical. Across the United States, they took part in all kinds of manual labor. Most worked in agriculture, picking fruit on farms in the South and West, pulling weeds, and harvesting cotton under the scorching Mississippi sun, herding cattle and milking cows in the Midwest, planting and cutting sugarcane in Louisiana, gathering pecans, and chopping firewood in winter. Forestry also relied heavily on prisoner labor, with men planting trees, felling timber, and sawing pine logs. In light industry, they served as helpers in canneries, sugar mills, and grain processing plants. Some were assigned to military hospitals, where they performed service duties and helped care for wounded American soldiers. Thousands of others worked directly inside military bases, assisting in kitchens, doing masonry work, painting and repairing buildings, laundering uniforms, and even cutting the hair of American troops. In places such as Fort Leonard Wood, which had previously served as an engineer training center, only a handful of prisoners initially volunteered for work. Before long, however, the numbers rose sharply as prisoners realized that working conditions and treatment were relatively good. By the end of 1943, this camp had become one of those with the highest rates of prisoner labor participation in the United States, with thousands of men involved in a wide range of tasks. Most notably, German prisoners with specialized skills, including engineers, mechanics, and stonemasons, were put to use on infrastructure projects. This was where the image of German prisoners building bridges for the United States became most tangible. At Fort Leonard Wood, once security conditions had stabilized, camp commanders gathered prisoners with technical expertise to carry out stone construction projects such as sidewalks, stairways, retaining walls, drainage culverts, building foundations, and even small bridges spanning streams within the base. Their work was careful and solid, to the point that many of these structures remained in place for decades after the war. Subtle details still reveal their presence, including discrete carvings bearing symbols of former units, a quiet way of leaving behind proof that they had been there. The irony was striking. Men who had once been trained to destroy enemy bridges and roads were now building, reinforcing, and beautifying the grounds of an American military base. Beyond work inside military installations, German prisoners also took part in civilian infrastructure projects outside the camps. In Texas, which held the largest concentration of prisoners, they contributed to major water control and power projects, digging earth, pouring concrete, and building roads. In many other locations, they helped widen and pave transportation routes. While guards always accompanied them, the nature of the work was little different from ordinary civilian labor. They went to work in the morning, returned to camp in the afternoon, received their pay, and then resumed daily camp life at the end of the day. In Mississippi, one unusual project clearly demonstrated how non-combat the prisoner labor system could be. It involved the construction of a massive-scale model, recreating the entire Mississippi River basin for flood control research. Hundreds of prisoners were mobilized to level the ground, dig channels, and build miniature roads and small wooden bridges within the model. Under the southern sun, they carefully shaped every bend of the river and every rise of terrain. For them, it was simply hard but legitimate work, paid labor that helped the days pass more quickly. Of course, not every prisoner accepted labor willingly. There were still resistant groups, especially ideological hardliners who believed that working for the enemy amounted to betrayal. Strikes and quiet acts of sabotage did occur. Some prisoners deliberately slowed their pace, produced poor quality work, or damaged tools. According to reports at Fort Leonard Wood, in just 5 months of 1,944, there were 130 cases of prisoners violating labor discipline due to laziness or sabotage, resulting in penalties such as wage cuts, loss of canteen privileges, or disciplinary confinement. At Camp Chaffee in Arkansas, prisoners once refused to unload crates they suspected contained weapons, arguing that doing so would help the Allies fight their own country. Camp commanders responded with harsh measures, confining the ringleaders inside a barbed wire enclosure between 2 fences, leaving them exposed to the sun without food or water, repeatedly asking every few hours whether they would work. This continued for an entire week, until the resistance finally collapsed. Such incidents were relatively rare, but they revealed the inner conflict many prisoners faced, torn between loyalty or resentment toward their former homeland and the reality that they were surviving under the care of their enemy. Even so, most prisoners accepted labor as the price of a more tolerable existence. A few who worked too eagerly were even suspected by fellow prisoners of being overly sympathetic to America. Yet the majority understood that the war was over for them, and that working for the United States was far preferable to returning to the battlefield, if only because it meant being fed and staying alive. Because they were treated humanely, and because labor in the United States did not resemble a sentence of punishment, many German prisoners began to change in a quiet but deeply profound way. When they were first captured, they carried with them an entire suitcase of fear and resentment. Fear of revenge, fear of humiliation, fear of being crushed in the ways they had been warned about by years of propaganda back in German barracks. Yet life in American camps gradually stripped away those layers of prejudice. They were still prisoners, still surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and strict discipline. But each passing day brought an inexplicable contradiction. They were adequately fed, medically treated, allowed to play sports, given opportunities to learn, and most striking of all, called out to work as laborers whose efforts actually mattered. When the moment of wages arrived, confusion truly set in. This was no longer just about being treated decently. It was the moment prisoners realized that their enemy was paying them real money, however small the amount, to pick up hammers, carry buckets, mix concrete, and build bridges for the United States itself. For many Germans, this was a psychological breaking point. If they were being held captive, why were they being paid? If they were the enemy, why were they treated like skilled workers? If war was built on hatred, why were there wages and time cards? It was at this point that the meaning of the story became unmistakably clear. They were not only astonished that they had survived, they were astonished that they were being paid to build for their enemy. After several months of paid labor, their thinking changed completely. They began to compare situations not through slogans or ideology, but through a cold instinct for survival. What would their fate have been if they had fallen into the hands of the Soviet Red Army? That fear was not imaginary. It was something German soldiers whispered about among themselves in the camps. A picture pieced together from rumors and letters. German prisoners in the East were often forced into marches marked by hunger and exposure, driven into exhausting labor, and many of them never returned. In the United States, however, they found themselves facing an almost unbelievable reality. They worked 6 days a week, rested on Sundays, had time to wash at the end of the day, received hot meals, and most importantly, had money they could save to buy something considered unnecessary in wartime. For a soldier accustomed to rationed food and months of being pushed to physical exhaustion, the ability to choose extra food with money earned by one's own labor created a feeling that was nearly impossible to describe. It carried both shame at being a prisoner and relief at still retaining some control over daily life. Then there were the small moments. Moments so minor they might seem insignificant, yet powerful enough to be remembered for a lifetime. A young prisoner named Günter Graue, captured in Normandy in 1944, later recalled that around August of that year, after receiving his first 80-cent wages at Fort Lewis in Washington, he stood hesitating in front of the camp canteen, unsure whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola with the money he had earned. It sounded childish, but in the context of war, it struck like a blow against everything he had been taught to believe. He recalled, "The last time I had eaten ice cream in Germany was many years earlier. I had never tasted Coca-Cola at all. So, I decided to buy both. And in that moment, I suddenly realized how lucky I was to have been captured by the American Army. That cold ice cream and the sweet bottle of Coca-Cola were not just snacks. They marked a turning point." 2. For the first time in the war, he felt that he was no longer being thrown aside by history like a piece of surplus material. They were items he bought with his own wages, something a prisoner of war would never have imagined possessing. From that moment on, the idea that German prisoners could not believe they were being paid to build bridges for the United States stopped sounding like a sensational headline and became a stark reality. America was turning enemies into paid workers, even as the war outside continued to take lives by the hour. Graue later spoke with striking honesty. What most prisoners truly cared about at the time was simply whether there was something good to eat. After months of being crushed by war, loyalty and slogans faded behind an empty stomach. He liked the meat and fresh vegetables in the rations. He liked the feeling of holding his wages and buying small luxuries, such as candy, cigarettes, and soft drinks. Items that in Germany at the time were often unavailable even to those who had money. What mattered most was that wages created a small but powerful sense of personal agency, enough to reshape a man's outlook. Prisoners might not trust their enemy, but they trusted the idea that each day they could produce something of value and receive a tangible reward in return. When you are a prisoner, the feeling that you can still do something meaningful can matter more than any speech. Graue's story was not unique. Many German prisoners later recalled that their time in American camps turned out to be one of the most positive experiences of their lives. Positive only in comparison to the front lines. Hunger, bombs, and the constant threat of death. Some even described it as a strange kind of adventure, moving from European trenches to American fields, from firing weapons to digging earth, mixing mortar, and building bridges. Paid labor created a paradox. They were still imprisoned, but they were not reduced to exhausted tools. They were still enemies, yet they were paid like craftsmen. Some grew so fond of the United States that they later tried to remain there. One notable example was the prisoner Georg Pabel, who escaped from camp and lived in hiding for 8 years as a successful businessman in America before being discovered and deported, only to return later as a legal resident and eventually become a U.S. citizen. At the same time, friendships between prisoners and local civilians emerged in a very ordinary, human way. Many farmers grew fond of the German prisoners who worked on their land, treating them like family members and welcoming them warmly. There are stories that after the war, a number of former German prisoners returned to the United States to visit these families, embracing their former hosts with tears in their eyes as they remembered the days spent working together in the fields, building fences, repairing roads, and sometimes contributing side by side to projects that seemed small at the time but remained part of the American landscape for many years. For Günter Graue in particular, the young man who once hesitated between ice cream and Coca-Cola never forgot the feeling that he had survived thanks to kindness and to a system built on rules rather than revenge. In 2017, at the age of 91, Graue made a special journey. He flew from Germany to the United States to visit Joint Base Lewis-McChord, formerly Fort Lewis, where he had once been held as a prisoner. There, the elderly former prisoner, his hair now white, rode a bicycle from the camp gate into the old barracks area, pointed out where his bed had once been, met with current American officers, and spoke the words, "Thank you, America," with visible emotion. He explained that he wanted to personally thank the United States for its humane treatment, and acknowledged that, had he not been captured by American forces, he likely would have died in the chaos of war. He also drew a strikingly contemporary comparison. "I think about prisoners of ISIS today," he said. "They would never have ice cream or Coca-Cola to drink. For me, the time I spent imprisoned here was the best treatment I ever received." It is in moments like this that one understands that some bridges are not built of steel or concrete, but are built through treating an enemy as a human being. Paying prisoners for their labor, even when they were helping to build bridges for the United States, created a psychological shock so profound that many Germans carried it with them for the rest of their lives. In a war constructed from violence, blood, and destruction, America introduced a startling paradox. Instead of crushing the defeated enemy, it paid for the enemy's labor. And sometimes, that choice proved more powerful in shaking old beliefs than any bomb. Not through gunfire, but through a small pay voucher held in the hand of a prisoner. The story of German prisoners being paid to build bridges for the United States sounds almost fabricated at first glance. Yet history has proven it to be entirely real, and not even rare. During World War II, the United States held hundreds of thousands of German soldiers on its own soil and treated them with a level of civility that surprised many observers. They were fed, clothed, given recreation, and allowed to work for pay. Men who had once risked their lives for Hitler ultimately found themselves holding trowels and building bridges and roads that helped their enemy develop its infrastructure. It was a profoundly human paradox at the heart of a brutal war. Why did the Americans do this? Partly because they adhered to international law and wanted to set a moral example. Partly because they sought to make practical use of an available labor force in a wartime economy. Whatever the motivations, the result was that many German prisoners survived because of this policy, and some even found a period of recovery within otherwise violent military careers. They built real bridges, and at the same time built bridges toward their own futures. Returning home with health, skills, and in some cases, their first American wages to help families endure the hardships of post-war life. Not a few of them, as we have seen, later returned to the United States with feelings of gratitude and friendship rather than bitterness. This story also serves as a reminder of the power of humane conduct. The United States could have chosen an easier path, starving and brutalizing German prisoners as punishment for fascist crimes. Instead, it chose a more principled course, even while facing criticism at home for being too soft. In the end, that very kindness transformed hearts, turning enemies into friends. German soldiers who had once trembled at the thought of capture finished the war in enemy camps with small sums of money, healthy bodies, and a radically different view of their former adversary. It is a lesson worth remembering. Sometimes humanity can prevail without a single shot being fired, and history contains chapters stranger and more powerful than we ever imagine. The bridges built by German prisoners in the United States may have been nothing more than small spans crossing streams inside military camps or miniature model bridges, but the story behind them remains a far greater bridge, linking the past to the present. It connects the two sides of a former battlefield and reveals a unique slice of World War II, where traces of humanity persisted even amid the most brutal conflict.